going to be filmed. So my name is John Parsons, and I'm an organizer with a group based here in St. John's called the Social Justice Cooperative. Most of what I do is I organize demonstrations, marches, these kind of things. But I also like doing these kind of workshops. So over the last few years, we've done a number of these. Some on, other ones have been on forms of democracy. Recently we had a teach-in around the refugee issue, the Syrian refugee crisis. Hello, Laura. And today, this is the first time we've run this one. It's a workshop on radicalism and how radicalism functions in movements. And I'm just going to jump right into it. So the way this is going to unfold here this evening is it's just a little bit more than an hour-long workshop. And I'm going to try to be conscious of everyone's time and finish up on time. We'll get out of here. But here's the sort of overview of the thing. First, we're going to define this term. And the definition that we're going to be using for radicalism, there's many ways to understand this concept. We're going to be using a term out of political science and sociology called radical flank effect. So we'll just talk a little bit about what that means, and then look at an example. And then the activities of the evening, sort of the workshop part of the event, are looking at a few of the historical and contemporary examples of movements that have radical flanks or potentially have radical flanks to try to understand how that works. And then to, if any of us are involved with organizations or groups that, or movements, to try and imagine ways that radical elements may help or possibly hinder our own work. Okay, just so that the whole point of the workshop is to try and understand this thing called radicalism in a way that's functional. Okay, so that it's not just about this scary term that, you know, in a lot of ways this word has been appropriated and is just thrown around as a way to dismiss movements sometimes or to dismiss groups sometimes. But we're going to try and talk about this in a somewhat more academic way. And as here are a few of the examples that we're going to look at: U.S. Civil Rights Movement, the Climate Change Movement, the contemporary refugees welcome movement that's still happening. And then this blank one, of course, is your movement, or the kind of things that you are involved with, okay? And then we have a few minutes at the end, just kind of a discussion to wrap up. So again, moving right into this, radicalism, or the term radical itself, is actually comes from math. Everything good in the world comes from math. And basically what we're getting here is this idea of the radical is the root of this thing that is represented underneath it, the radicand. I don't know anything about math. So you can any math people here who knows what this means, I don't really. The square root of, or the root of function of something?
Yes, square of x or something.
Okay.
I don't know math either. So.
Yeah, arts and humanities people try to figure out what this means. Just to say that this is where the term comes from. It's a very old term, and at some point it got used to start to describe things that are political, and to start to describe political action and the way certain kinds of a certain part of the spectrum, the political spectrum, works. And here's a really bare definition of it, of or going to the root. And you can see how this comes out of that mathematical idea, because it is about going to the root of something, the root of the equation in that case, or in this case, the root of the issue, to go to the heart of the issue, okay? And the way that it's often talked about is, you know, a radical difference, or to make something change in a fundamental way, okay? And here is the definition that we get, of course, from the dictionaries, and this is, of course, Radicalism Defined, so we may as well define it. And you can see the kind of words that are being used here. Fundamental change, far-reaching change, okay, as an adjective, and then as a noun, the person who advocates for this kind of change, okay, or the person or groups who are looking for these kind of major overhauls of things, or major changes. And really the method, or the sort of messaging of radicalism is such that it's trying to go to the heart of issues. I think this is important. Some of the synonyms that were given for it in our dictionaries: revolutionary, progressive, and reformist. And I put them in this order because I don't know that reformist, to me anyways, indicates radical, but nonetheless you can see how these ideas are linked, okay? In history, and this is what I've learned from my research and from the work I've been doing, just getting ready for this little workshop, historically radical only applied to the left. At least typically that's where radicals were supposed to have been. The term for people on the right, on the far right, was always extremist. But nowadays the term is sort of used to describe everybody, as it's used in sort of popular discourse. Hello, Robert. Yeah, so as I say here, historically anyways, when this term was first being used to describe political activity, it was only the far left. But I would say, and this is again an observation just from my own thinking about this, that there's a lot of radical groups out there that I wouldn't put on the left or the right, depending on what sorts of movements or what sorts of causes they're advocating for. And I think we're going to see that in some of the examples that we're going to be talking about here today. For example, the climate change movement and the radical elements of the climate change movement. I don't know that I would put them on exactly what we call the left of the spectrum or the right of the spectrum. You know, it seems to sort of not sit well with left-right political spectrum in some ways. Some of these radical groups anyways. Other groups, of course, we can very clearly define as leftist or right groups. Okay, and just a word on violence, because this is what seems to be meant a lot of times when people use the term radical, but it doesn't necessarily indicate violence. Radical and radicalism, once again, is about the views that are being expressed and the way those views are being expressed, the kind of analysis that's being brought to understand problems, more so than saying anything necessarily about tactics. Okay? Nonetheless, there have been a lot of what you would call radical groups that have employed violent means. And the studies that I've seen, some suggest that political groups that are willing to use violence will be more successful, and some studies suggest that political groups that are not willing or that use violence are going to be less successful. And there's no clear sort of consensus on this, okay? So just to say that, you know, the way we're going to try and talk about radicalism here today is a little bit separate from this question of violence. Radical groups don't have to be violent, sometimes they are. And really, this is where I'm hoping that we're going to get with this discussion and where I want to move into this. We're talking about strategy and tactics here today. We're not so much talking about the political spectrum. So how these kinds of radical elements, radical flanks in particular movements work, okay? If they work well, if they don't work well. And as I say, sometimes these radical elements in groups have a positive effect, and sometimes they have a negative effect. And this is where we're talking about this effect of radical elements in movements. Okay. This term that we're using today, radical flank effect, again, it's one of many ways to understand radicalism. This term was coined by Joe Freeman, who's written a number of books in political science on social movements and these kind of things, and has been taken up by a number of other scholars. I was put onto this term by the gentleman who was actually here 4 weeks ago for the Henrietta Harvey lecture, Riley Dunlap, who came up to talk about discourse and climate change and the way that various elements in the climate change discourse, he specifically looks at the denial movement. But I was asking him questions afterwards about the effect that if there's a denial movement, and then if there's sort of a moderate climate change movement, then what's this thing on the other side called that seems to try and pull the discourse more towards the middle? And he said to me that I might look up this term, radical flank effect, and I've read a number of papers. The Wikipedia article on this, if you want to look it up yourself, links to all the papers. So there's a number of really good papers that you can find on the bottom of the Wikipedia article by the scholars who are doing the most work with this term right now. Okay, so if this is something you're interested in reading more of. Now, in very plain terms, now this does get a lot more complicated in the way that these scholars are trying to quantify what's positive and what's negative in terms of the effect that radical elements have on movements. But in a very broad sense, this is what a positive radical flank is about, that the radicals make the moderates, or make the moderate part of the movement more amenable, sometimes more amenable to power. Okay? So there's this radical message that's being brought, and people hear it and they might think to themselves, wow, that's pretty extreme, it makes some sense, but they don't want to see the kind of big changes that radical element is pushing for. It makes the middle ground, or the sort of modest, more reformist elements seem really reasonable and seem like something that, well, we just ought to do that anyways because it just makes so much sense. So the point here is that in a positive radical flank, so when it has a positive effect on a movement, that radical element is helpful in getting these more moderate or reformist things through, or getting concessions from power. The other thing that radicals can do, and this is an interesting point, is that they can create crises, right? So they can create disruption, or they can create a situation in which, to calm sort of the public mentality, or to calm the discourse down, power may make concessions. Okay, and I use power there in that sort of big sense, but governments or whoever it is that people are trying to get concessions from. Okay? Along with this idea that radical flanks can be positive, there's the flip side of that coin, saying that radical elements can have negative impacts on movements. And there's examples where radical elements can, in the literature, as it's described, discredit the movement, or make other parts of the movement seem like it's itself radical. So people can't then maybe join, or feel like they can't become a part of this thing. It has the effect of sort of quelling mass mobilization at times. Okay, and the second point here, that it may, radicals may make it harder for moderates to collaborate or to get things done. Okay, because people can point at them and say, well, are these the kind of folks that you want to be dealing with? We're going to look at a couple of examples here now. The first one I'm going to sort of talk through, and then the rest of the workshop is you all basically looking at a few examples in small groups. But just before I go forward, I do want to make a point about this negative radical flank, because I'm not sure that we're going to see a whole lot of clear examples. A lot of this is debatable. It's going to be up to, different people will have different perspectives on the same radical group, right? So a radical group that some people might say, oh, they're having a real positive impact on this movement. Other people might look at it and say, well, it's not really having a very good effect at all, right? So what I like about this theory of radical flank effect is more so that it's a way to talk about radicalism, or it's a way to talk about the pros and cons of radical elements of movements, rather than to say they're always good or they're always bad or anything like that. It's just a frame around which we can have a discussion about this, right? And I think that that's useful in its own way. But one example of a negative radical flank that I've been thinking of, and I didn't include in this in the workshop, was in the United States in the late 60s, early 70s. There was a huge student movement. And one of the most important groups at the middle of that was Students for a Democratic Society, right, SDS. And SDS had huge numbers, and people all across the country, chapters all across the United States, and they were very, very active and a very powerful organization. A splinter group formed within that came to be called Weather Underground, or the Weathermen. And they were much more radical, and they carried out a bombing campaign at some point in time in the United States. It didn't hurt anybody, but the effect that that group had on the broader SDS movement, I would say, was quite negative. And some of the people who were involved in that, in Weather Underground, and who were involved in that student movement, have later said so. They said, we felt that it was a revolutionary situation, or it was a situation where using these kind of tactics would be helpful, but in retrospect, we feel now that we were mistaken. Okay, so this is what Bill Ayers and some of the others have said about what happened. Okay, so that's maybe an example of a negative radical flank. Okay, and just to say too, you know, and I'm sort of repeating what I've just said, but this is, you know, it's just a framework around which we can discuss this. And really the point of the workshop here is not to be dogmatic about the definitions, even though it's called Radicalism Defined. The point here really is to try and understand if radical elements might be useful to our movements or to the things that we're doing out in the community right now. Like recently I've been involved with a lot of organizing around the Refugees Welcome movement, and we have purposefully set out to present a certain radical message in order to try and solidify the central part of this movement. Okay, so, and is there anyone here from any unions, or? It's too bad. Maybe one day we could do this again, especially for unions, because I think that unions might benefit from thinking a little bit more about how radicalism works, and maybe they might find some strategic or tactical advantages from these kind of things. Okay, so case study number one, and I'm just, as I said, I'm just going to quickly talk through this one, and then we're going to do you guys are going to do the rest of it. I thought this was a real good one to start with, because the Black Panthers and other radical elements that emerged during the time of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement had a dramatic impact on what was going on in the United States. So sort of the more moderate elements of this movement, arguably, are the groups and organizations epitomized by Dr. Martin Luther King. Okay, so this was, in some sense, a kind of a Christian reformist message. Okay, black people in the United States, we want an end to segregation, or we want certain rights to be granted that are supposed to be granted to us. You know, it was a moderate message. Whereas the message then that the Panthers brought, and that other groups, not just the Panthers, Nation of Islam was another part of this radical flank, arguably, epitomized by Malcolm X. They brought a message that was much more going to the root of the issue. And does anyone like to say maybe what that message was, or how that worked? Anyone has a comment on that?
On Nation of Islam and Black Panthers?
Yeah, let's say, what was their message?
Empower black people? Or Black Lives Matter, really?
Kind of. I mean,
I think so. It was more just black self-determination. It's just liberation can't be done in integration with the majority white population. Or if they want to do that, they have to organize on their own. But the self-organization of black people is what's most important in organization.
How aggressively they came out and did it. Whereas Martin Luther King was more peaceful, rallies. The Black Panthers were kind of a lot more aggressive in the way they went about their ways.
their rhetoric even was a lot more aggressive. And a lot of what they showed up with weapons in the early days at, say, the Congress buildings or these kind of things, and they stormed into these buildings and scared the hell out of a lot of white people, you know? And, but part of it was theatrical, of course, but the other side of it, of course, was the way that they tried to engage in the discourse. And for example, Nation of Islam and certain aspects of the Black Panther Party were what you call black nationalism. So they weren't saying that we want to have a society where we're just going to be integrated into it and everyone have equal rights. They were saying, we want a country. Like, we want some territory, we want to have our own government, we don't want to be ruled by the white man anymore. So the analysis that they were bringing was much more fundamental and calling for a much more fundamental change. Yeah, Daniel?
I think there was another, something else I think when I think of the Black Panther Party. There was a quote by one of their leaders that said, like, you know, the police, they don't want to try to arrest and kill us because we have guns. They want to try to arrest and kill us because we are socialists. And they, in addition to the sort of tactics you just described, they also did things like The most common one that's mentioned is free breakfast programs for children, right? And so I think there was something, like they were very strongly anti-capitalist.
Yep.
And they weren't afraid, they were very vocal about that. And then they also acted on it, right? They gave people what they needed, free breakfast or whatever. So I think that was also terrifying.
Police their own communities, did
Yeah.
their own traffic stops was the one sort of thing.
Yeah.
And they liked Mao. I guess they called themselves a Maoist group, and they had the little red book, right? And they distributed it pretty broadly. You know, they had connections with the Russians and in Cuba, right? So they were certainly presenting this much more radical message than what we were seeing from Martin Luther King, kind of in the middle. Now again, if you happen to have been, the white status quo in America, even sort of liberal white America, Martin Luther King might have looked pretty radical to you, right? But then you've got this further aspect of the movement that's pulling things way out to the other side, and that makes King's message seem just so much more amenable, right? And this is what a lot of scholars have argued about. Why the civil rights movement was ultimately successful, why Kennedy not only approved to allow the big march on Washington that happened, but encouraged it because they were trying to quell what was an otherwise explosive situation, right? So there was in this sense, you could say that the way I'm describing it here now, that the Panthers and sort of this whole radical element of the civil rights movement had a very positive effect on the sort of moderate message. But just before we move on, is there any way we can imagine that you could say that the Panthers had a negative effect on the movement?
I imagine it had a negative effect on...
I do want to say, and I think it's come out in a lot of the comments that have just been made here, again, how slippery these terms radical and radicalism are. And again, the whole point of this workshop, if we're trying to understand in terms of this radical flag and the way that there's maybe potentially this positive negative effect, again, is only one of many ways to talk about this, and it's probably only useful to a point. Okay? So I hope that the activities and the discussions coming up can try to at least revolve around this idea, but if it's not entirely helpful, well, however else we can talk about these things, it's all good as far as I'm concerned. So the next case, and this is case study number 2, and what I'm going to do is get everybody to work in small groups, maybe groups of 4, I think, 3 or 4 people would work. You're going to need somebody in your group to be a scribe, so to take a few notes, and somebody who's going to report back, maybe the same person, maybe not. What you want to do is just for the first minute, just introduce yourself to the people in your group so that we can all know each other's names, and maybe if you're here with an organization or something like that. And we'll take, say, 10 minutes for the discussion on the climate change movement. This little graph that I made here, this is for part of my research is on discourse and climate change and trying to understand where various things sit in the climate change discourse. Actually, Erica made the graph for me, because she has better graphic skills than I do. But here's the game plan. So, I'm sure you can imagine where this discussion really needs to go. So, what kinds of groups or views may constitute the radical flank in the climate change movement? What is the message? What is it that's radical about what they're saying? Like what route are they trying to cut to? And positive or negative effect. Okay, so does this sound like something we can do? Groups of 4, get a scribe, say hi to your group. All right, and I'll call everyone back to order in 10 minutes.
Okay. Group of 4, do you want to do it?
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'll say one.
Okay. So the next case study here is on the ongoing, and this one is one that's pretty close to me right now because I've been organizing around this issue for the last number of months. But on the refugees welcome, or on this issue of refugees, and especially what I'm trying to think of is in the Canadian context here. Of course, there's big movement happening sort of in the global west, I suppose we could call it. But generally what I hope we can think about is to try and think about what's going on here in our own country. And I'm not going to give you too much of a prompt or too much preamble to this one. I'm just going to throw you back into your groups and see what comes of this one. Think this is doable?
Yep.
It's going to be a bit more of a challenge.
How long do we have? 15 minutes.
10, 12 minutes. I guess again, we don't have much more than another minute here, but the last part of this was going to be for you to try and talk about your own groups or your own organizations or movements that you're involved in relation to radical elements. But I think we're just going to have to kind of wrap it up here now. It was just going to be another kind of discussion element like this. So you can see how the whole workshop was supposed to have worked. The closing discussion, I did want to just, and I'm gonna just close now in just 1 minute. But I do think that there's some good criticisms of this theory and the way that it's been talked about. For one, and I'll just say this one and then see if there's any comments before we finish. For one, this theory, radical flank effects, seems to understand radical elements in movements purely as something that is always bound to fail, or that is never going to achieve any success, because the only thing, at least in this theory, and the way that these scholars have formulated it, the only thing that radicals can do is help moderates. Radicals can never win, according to the way that they discuss this. And I don't know that that really seems to line up with what I've seen in reality sometimes, because radicals do sometimes win. Radical elements do sometimes prove victorious. There are revolutions. Things happen all the time that kind of don't line up really well with the way that this theory of radical flank effects works. Nonetheless, I do think it's good for a discussion model and a good way to frame a discussion, but I do think that's at least one criticism that can be made of it. And I wonder, do you guys, are there any other thoughts on critiques of this sort of model for understanding? Okay, well, I think we really ought to wrap up. I do want to thank you all very much for coming out. And these materials are on the Facebook event that was organized for this, if anyone wants the materials. And I'm also going to put them on our organization's website in the next little while. So if anyone wants this and the subsequent, if anything comes of this video, I don't know even how good it's going to be, but that will all be publicly available. Okay, so thank you all once again for coming out. Hopefully we'll see you again soon. We'll do something like this again.